July 14, 2005 started like any other summer morning in Hutchinson, Kansas. The streets were quiet, with the hum of early traffic and birdsong filling the air. Most residents were accustomed to a peaceful life, the kind of small-town tranquility that made neighbors wave as they walked past, and children rode bikes until dusk. But that morning, a dark shadow would settle over one family that would linger for years. Melanie Carter, a 24-year-old elementary school teacher, had failed to show up for her class at Lincoln Elementary. Her co-workers initially assumed she might be sick or running late, but when calls to her phone went unanswered, concern began to grow. Melanie was reliable, responsible, and deeply loved by her students. When her parents, Robert and Susan Carter, called and received no response, a knot of fear tightened in their stomachs. Something was wrong. By mid-morning, they decided to drive to Melanie's apartment on West Avenue, a modest unit she had rented for several years. When they arrived, they found her front door slightly ajar. Their hearts pounded as they stepped inside. The living room was undisturbed, but the apartment carried an unsettling stillness. Melanie's purse was on the counter, her car keys inside it. Her laptop lay open, documents scattered as though she had been interrupted mid. The silence was oppressive, and then they noticed her bedroom. Melanie lay on her bed, a single gunshot wound to the chest, her lifeless eyes staring toward the ceiling. Shock and disbelief overwhelmed her parents. Their daughter, vibrant and full of life just hours before, was gone. The police arrived quickly after the Carters' frantic call, with officers securing the apartment and beginning an investigation. Detective Harold Simmons, a seasoned investigator with 20 years on the force, was assigned to the case. He knew that the first hours of a murder investigation were critical, and the scene told him immediately that this was not a random act of violence. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication of robbery, and Melanie's valuables were untouched. The initial theory considered by investigators was that someone she knew had committed the crime. The neatness of the apartment suggested familiarity. The perpetrator had moved confidently, aware of the layout, unafraid of leaving evidence behind. As Detective Simmons and his team began canvassing the neighborhood, they interviewed neighbors, friends, and co-workers. Melanie was widely respected and well-liked. She had no known enemies. Her colleagues described her as warm and nurturing, a teacher who went above and beyond for her students. Yet someone had ended her life abruptly, leaving behind a void that rippled through the tight-knit Kansas community. The investigation quickly expanded to examine her personal life. Melanie had been in a committed relationship with Jason Hargrove, a young accountant living just a few blocks away. Their relationship appeared stable on the surface, but investigators discovered tension beneath. Friends mentioned occasional arguments over finances and future plans, but nothing suggested violence or a credible threat. Jason was interviewed thoroughly, and while his demeanor seemed cooperative, he expressed profound grief and shock at the loss of his partner. With no immediate suspects, the case began to cool. Weeks passed with few leads, and the story became a local mystery. Residents spoke in hushed tones about the tragedy, wondering how someone so ordinary and so beloved could fall victim to such a crime. The Carters struggled to process their grief, holding vigils and seeking comfort in their faith and community. Over the years, the case became a haunting memory, a file marked unsolved in the Hutchinson Police Department. Investigators rotated through assignments, and new cases took priority, but Detective Simmons and a few dedicated officers never fully closed Melanie's file. They returned periodically, hoping for a breakthrough that never came. By 2010, the investigation had gone cold. Advances in forensic science, however, offered a glimmer of hope. DNA technology was rapidly evolving, allowing investigators to analyze smaller and older samples with higher accuracy. Melanie's case file contained items that had been carefully preserved. A swab from her clothing and hair samples collected from the bedroom. These were re-examined using modern techniques, and the results were promising. Forensic analysts discovered a partial DNA profile that had been undetectable. In 2005, this profile did not match anyone in state or federal criminal databases at the time, but it was a starting point. Detective Simmons, now heading a cold case unit, collaborated with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation to cross-reference the DNA with all recent databases, hoping that the perpetrator might have left a digital trace through other criminal activity. In 2012, the breakthrough came. The DNA from Melanie's clothing matched an individual with a prior record of burglary and assault in neighboring states. Nathaniel Nate Morris, 33 years old at the time of the match, had moved through Kansas sporadically over the years, leaving a trail of minor offenses but never violent crimes until this revelation. Investigators moved quickly to gather additional evidence, checking Morris's employment history, phone records, and travel patterns. They discovered he had been in Hutchinson around the time of Melanie's murder, corroborated by gas station receipts and witness statements placing a man of his description in the area. This reinforced the probability that he was the person responsible for the crime. Detectives also sought physical evidence linking Morris to Melanie's apartment, reviewing photographs from the original scene. They noted a few subtle anomalies: a faint footprint on the windowsill, a tiny fiber clutched in Melanie's hand, and traces of soil near the apartment entrance. All of these could be matched to Morris's known locations, reinforcing the case against him. When Maurice was located in Wichita, he was taken into custody for questioning. During interviews, he initially denied any involvement with Melanie. He claimed he had never been near Hutchinson at the time, and that the DNA match must be coincidental. Detectives remained firm, presenting him with evidence collected over the years: the DNA profile, travel records, and witness accounts. As the interrogation progressed, cracks appeared in Morris's story. When asked about his presence near West Avenue on the day of the murder, he hesitated and eventually admitted he had been in Hutchinson, but insisted it had been for an unrelated errand. Detectives then presented the fiber and soil evidence. Confronted with the cumulative weight of forensic and circumstantial evidence, Morris's demeanor shifted from defiance to unease. The psychological pressure, combined with the certainty of his impending capture, left him vulnerable. After hours of questioning, he finally confessed to being in Melanie's apartment on the day of her death. He claimed it had started as a burglary, but when Melanie unexpectedly returned, events escalated into a confrontation, resulting in her death. The confession, along with the forensic evidence, provided the prosecutors with a compelling case. Charges were filed immediately, and Morris was held without bail as legal proceedings began. The community of Hutchinson was shocked by the revelation. The man responsible for a crime that had haunted the town for 7 years was not a stranger, but someone who had moved quietly through their lives. Families reflected on how isolating tragedy could strike in a town they believed to be safe, reinforcing the need for vigilance and community engagement. Melanie's family, while relieved that justice was finally within reach, faced a resurgence of grief as court dates approached. They attended therapy, sought support from friends, and prepared to recount their daughter's life and the loss they had endured in a public courtroom. Meanwhile, the investigative team prepared their case meticulously, anticipating challenges from defense attorneys who would attempt to question the validity of the decades-old evidence. Expert witnesses were consulted to explain the reliability of DNA testing, especially as technology had advanced since the time of the crime. Forensic analysts detailed how preserved evidence could now produce results that were previously impossible, and how the integrity of the collection process in 2005 had ensured that the findings were admissible in court. The stage was set for a trial that would not only provide closure for Melanie's family, but also demonstrate the power of forensic science in solving cold cases. Prosecutors emphasized that while the crime had remained unsolved for years, persistence, technological advancement, and careful investigative work had ensured that the perpetrator would be held accountable. As the trial date approached, the entire community remained invested in the outcome. Local news outlets provided coverage, highlighting the emotional journey of the Carter family and the dedication of law enforcement officers who had never given up. The anticipation was palpable, and residents gathered outside the courthouse, eager to witness justice after so many years of uncertainty. The courtroom itself became a place where grief, relief, and the pursuit of justice converged. Emily Carter's memory loomed over the proceedings, her life and potential celebrated by those who spoke on her behalf, and the crime recounted in meticulous detail to ensure the jury understood the gravity of the offense. The trial would reveal the full scope of Maurice's actions, the impact on the victim's family, and the power of modern forensic science to bring closure even after years of unanswered questions. The trial of Nathaniel Morris began on a crisp autumn morning in 2013, nearly 8 years after Melanie Carter's life had been stolen. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation. News crews lined the sidewalks, and townspeople gathered, some whispering to each other, others silently clutching programs listing the schedule for the proceedings. For the Carter family, this was the culmination of years filled with grief, uncertainty, and hope for eventual justice. Melanie's mother, Susan, held tightly to a framed photograph of her daughter, while her father, Robert, carried a notebook filled with memories and statements from friends and family to share during testimony. From the start, the prosecution presented a methodical case, relying heavily on the DNA evidence that had been preserved and analyzed using modern forensic technology. Dr. Evelyn Harper, a forensic biologist, testified in detail about how the DNA found on Melanie's clothing matched Maurice's profile. She explained that while technology in 2005 had not been sensitive enough to detect the small sample, advances in DNA amplification allowed the team to produce a definitive match. She also explained the meticulous chain of custody that had ensured the sample's integrity over the years. The defense, however, tried to challenge the credibility of the evidence, arguing that it had been too old to rely on and that contamination could not be ruled out. They attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's case, but Dr. Harper's calm and precise explanation reassured the jury that the evidence was sound. Next, the prosecution presented witnesses who had interacted with Maurice around the time of the crime. A gas station clerk testified that he remembered seeing a man resembling Morris purchase gasoline and snacks near West Avenue on the morning of July 14, 2005. A neighbor recalled hearing a loud bang and seeing someone rush from the Carter apartment complex. Each piece of testimony, while small, created a web of corroborating details that linked Morris to the scene. The most harrowing testimony came from Melanie's friends and colleagues. They spoke of her warmth, her dedication to teaching, and her dreams for the future. One co-worker described Melanie's habit of leaving little notes of encouragement for students, while another recounted her excitement about planning a summer camp for her class. Their words painted a vivid picture of a young woman whose life had been cruelly cut short. The courtroom was heavy with emotion as the Carters took the stand. Robert Carter, voice trembling, described the day he found his daughter and the profound void that had filled their lives since. Susan recounted the sleepless nights, the endless prayers, and the longing for closure. Every word was a reminder of the human cost of the crime, emphasizing the stakes for the jury. Maurice's defense team continued to press their case, arguing that the DNA could have been transferred innocently or that Maurice had never been at the apartment. They attempted to undermine the witness statements, highlighting inconsistencies in recollections after nearly a decade. But the prosecution countered effectively, showing that multiple pieces of evidence converged, leaving little room for reasonable doubt. During cross-examination, Morris's demeanor began to show signs of strain. Initially calm and dismissive, he grew defensive when confronted with the cumulative evidence. Witness after witness recalled seeing him near the scene, and the DNA evidence remained incontrovertible. The psychological weight of facing 8 years of meticulous investigation finally began to crack his composure. Outside the courtroom, the town's reaction was a mix of relief and tension. Residents who had followed the case for years discussed the proceedings over coffee, expressing gratitude for the persistence of law enforcement. Others expressed frustration at the time it had taken to reach this point. But the overarching sentiment was hope. Hope that Melanie's family would finally receive the justice they had waited so long for. The prosecution then introduced digital evidence, including cell phone records, placing Morris near West Avenue on the morning of the murder. This evidence further cemented the timeline and contradicted Morris's earlier statements. Investigators had meticulously retraced his movements, showing that he had the opportunity and the means to commit the crime. Each revelation added pressure, and the courtroom grew tense as the jury absorbed the full weight of the evidence. Over several days, the trial delved into the events leading up to Melanie's death. Testimony from friends revealed that she had been cautious but trusting, and that she had known no reason to fear anyone in her immediate circle. This reinforced the notion that Morris had exploited a position of opportunity, targeting her apartment with calculated intent. The defense attempted to portray him as a troubled man with no violent tendencies, emphasizing his non-violent criminal record outside of minor offenses. But the prosecution countered with his own admissions during the investigation, where he confessed that what began as a burglary escalated to murder when Melanie unexpectedly returned home. This confession, corroborated by forensic evidence, left the jury with little doubt about his responsibility. One particularly emotional moment came when a neighbor testified about hearing a gunshot that day and seeing a figure fleeing the scene. The witness had been unable to identify the person at the time, but now recognized that the description fit Morris perfectly. This testimony bridged the gap between circumstantial and direct evidence, further reinforcing the prosecution's case. As the trial progressed, expert psychologists testified about the behavior of offenders who commit crimes of opportunity, explaining how panic and self-preservation often lead to escalation. They linked these behavioral patterns to Maurice's confession and actions, helping the jury understand the sequence of events in the absence of direct eyewitness accounts. The jury was also presented with a recreation of the crime scene. Using photographs and diagrams, prosecutors walked them through Melanie's apartment, pointing out the locations of key evidence, the blood spatter, the fiber found in her hand, and the traces of soil near the entrance. The presentation helped jurors visualize the crime, bridging the gap between technical forensic language and real-world understanding. The final day of testimony was particularly emotional. Melanie's colleagues and family delivered statements expressing the lasting impact of her death. Her students, now older, spoke through letters read aloud in court, describing how she had inspired them and how her absence had left a permanent mark on their lives. The letters brought tears to the courtroom, humanizing the victim beyond the evidence and testimony. Closing arguments emphasized both the human and factual elements of the case. The prosecution reminded the jury of the consistent and converging evidence, the DNA match, witness testimonies, cell phone records, and Morris's own admissions. They stressed that justice for Melanie was long overdue, and that the defendant's actions had left a family shattered for years. The defense pleaded for leniency, citing Maurice's minor criminal history and arguing that the time elapsed had made memories less reliable. They asked the jury to consider doubt, but their arguments were overshadowed by the weight of the evidence and the emotional testimony that had filled the courtroom. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courthouse was silent, everyone awaiting the decision that would finally close a painful chapter. Hours passed, with the tension mounting outside as the town held its collective breath. Inside, jurors discussed each piece of evidence, weighing the testimony, DNA results, and confessions carefully. Finally, after long deliberations, they returned with a verdict. The courtroom filled with anticipation as the foreperson read aloud, "Guilty on all counts." A collective exhale swept through the room. Melanie's family wept openly, feeling a mixture of grief, relief, and closure. The judge scheduled sentencing, ensuring that Morris would face the full consequences of his actions. Outside the courthouse, community members spoke of the importance of perseverance in seeking justice. Local newspapers ran stories highlighting the dedication of law enforcement officers who had never given up on the case, and the role of forensic advancements in solving crimes that had once seemed unsolvable. The victory was bittersweet. Melanie's life could never be restored, and the years her family had spent in anguish could not be returned. Yet, knowing that the man responsible was held accountable brought a measure of peace. It underscored that even in cases that remain cold for years, justice can eventually prevail through diligence, scientific progress, and unrelenting human determination. In the weeks following the verdict, the Carters spoke publicly about their experience. They emphasized the importance of community support, cooperation with law enforcement, and hope for other families still searching for answers. Their story became a testament to resilience and the enduring pursuit of justice, inspiring others who had faced similar tragedies. Meanwhile, investigators who had worked tirelessly on the case reflected on the significance of persistence. They noted that while the case had lain dormant for years, their commitment to preserving evidence, revisiting leads, and embracing new technology had ultimately solved the mystery. For Detective Simmons, who had first arrived at Melanie's apartment in 2005, the resolution of the case was a professional and personal milestone. He described the sense of closure as profound, knowing that the perpetrator had been brought to account and that the community could begin to heal. Though the trial and verdict could not undo the harm done, they marked a turning point, proving that even years of uncertainty could not prevent justice from being served. As the town of Hutchinson gradually returned to its quiet rhythms, Melanie's memory endured. Schools commemorated her dedication to teaching, and a scholarship fund was established in her name to support aspiring educators. Her story, though tragic, became a symbol of hope that truth and justice could eventually prevail. No matter how much time had passed, the sentencing day arrived in the spring of 2014, nearly 9 years after Melanie Carter's life had been taken. The courthouse was packed with journalists, townspeople, and family members. The air was heavy with anticipation, a mix of sorrow, relief, and the long-awaited closure that had eluded the Carters for nearly a decade. Melanie's parents, Susan and Robert, sat quietly in the front row, holding tightly to each other. Their grief was still raw, but they were determined to witness the justice that had long been overdue. The judge began the proceedings by recounting the details of the crime, the evidence presented, and the findings of the jury. The judge spoke deliberately, emphasizing the premeditation, callousness, and devastating impact of the murder on Melanie's family and the community. The gravity of the words resonated through the room, leaving no doubt about the seriousness of Nathaniel Morris's actions. When the prosecution spoke, they focused on the enduring pain caused by Morris's crime. They recounted the Carters' long struggle to find answers, the years spent in uncertainty, and the emotional scars left on friends, family, and the wider community. They reminded the court that justice was not only about punishment but about accountability, closure, and the recognition of the harm done. Morris's defense attorney attempted a final plea, emphasizing his client's troubled past, the years that had passed, and the possibility of rehabilitation. Yet, it was clear that the weight of the evidence, the confession, and the jury's verdict left little room for leniency. The judge considered these statements, but ultimately concluded that the severity of the crime demanded a strong sentence. Nathaniel Morris was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought an overwhelming mix of emotions to the courtroom. Susan and Robert Carter wept openly, feeling a profound sense of relief and vindication. Friends and community members, who had waited for nearly a decade, expressed a sense of justice finally fulfilled, while the pain of losing Melanie could never be erased. Knowing that the man responsible would no longer pose a threat to anyone brought a measure of peace. In the weeks following the sentencing, the community reflected on the long journey that had led to justice. Local law enforcement shared their experiences, highlighting the importance of persistence in cold cases. Detectives explained how advances in forensic science, especially DNA technology, had allowed them to revisit old evidence and solve a crime that had once seemed impossible to crack. They stressed the importance of meticulous record-keeping, careful evidence preservation, and the refusal to abandon cases simply because time had passed. For Melanie's family, the resolution of the case marked both an ending and a beginning. The grieving process, which had been prolonged and filled with uncertainty, could finally move forward with a sense of closure. They established a scholarship fund in Melanie's name, supporting local students pursuing careers in education, and participated in community events to raise awareness about safety and the importance of reporting suspicious activity. The story of Melanie Carter and her tragic loss became a symbol of perseverance, hope, and the power of justice. Local media outlets chronicled the journey from the day she disappeared to the final sentencing, emphasizing the role of modern forensic science in solving cold cases. They highlighted the dedication of law enforcement officers, the persistence of the family, and the importance of community vigilance. Over time, the town of Hutchinson began to heal. Residents spoke openly about the case, sharing memories of Melanie and reflecting on how the tragedy had affected their lives. Schools honored her memory with special programs, and local organizations used her story to educate people about crime prevention and the critical role of evidence in solving cases. For law enforcement, the case became a benchmark in cold case investigations. Detectives and forensic experts who worked on Melanie's case shared their methods and experiences with colleagues across the state and nation. The case illustrated the value of revisiting unsolved crimes, applying new technology, and maintaining hope that justice could eventually be served, no matter how much time had passed. As years went by, the Carter family continued to honor Melanie's legacy. They remained active in the community, advocating for safety initiatives and supporting families of victims. They spoke publicly about the importance of never giving up hope, encouraging other families still searching for answers to remain persistent. Melanie's students, some of whom had been very young at the time of her death, grew up remembering her kindness, dedication, and the impact she had on their lives. Many pursued careers in teaching, inspired by her example, and shared stories of how she had motivated them to strive for excellence. Even in moments of quiet reflection, the Carters felt the presence of their daughter in the community she had loved. The scholarship fund in her name allowed her influence to continue shaping the lives of young people, ensuring that her legacy lived on despite the tragedy that had ended her life. Law enforcement continued to learn from the case. The investigation reinforced the importance of revisiting cold cases, using advances in forensic science, and maintaining meticulous evidence management. The story of Melanie Carter became a model for how perseverance, collaboration, and technological progress could converge to solve even the most challenging crimes. Looking back, the resolution of the case illustrated the passage of time not as a barrier, but as a process that, when combined with dedication, could lead to justice. The town of Hutchinson remembered Melanie Carter, not only for the tragedy of her death, but for the lasting positive impact she had on those around her. Through scholarships, community programs, and the memories of students and colleagues, her life continued to resonate, even as the person responsible for her death faced the consequences of his actions. The emotional journey of the Carter family highlighted the resilience of the human spirit. From the initial shock of Melanie's disappearance to the long years of uncertainty, and finally to the resolution of the case, their story became an inspiration for families everywhere who faced the anguish of unresolved loss. In the end, the case of Melanie Carter stood as a testament to the fact that justice, though sometimes delayed, could not be denied. The tireless work of law enforcement, the advancement of forensic science, and the unwavering determination of a family determined to honor their daughter culminated in a resolution that, while unable to restore what was lost, provided accountability, closure, and hope for the future. Even as the town moved forward, Melanie's story remained a poignant reminder that the pursuit of truth and justice was never in vain. Her life, though tragically cut short, had left an indelible mark on her family, students, and community. The memory of Melanie Carter became a beacon for perseverance, teaching, and hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, dedication and courage could ultimately shine through, bringing long-awaited justice and peace to those left behind.